We are on to Module 3 in 279W at Clackamas Community College with our hands-on Windows Server 2016 book. And we just covered Chapter 3 in our last module. Now we're going to look at Chapter 4. So we've got several objectives, such as some Active Directory basic type of information, what Active Directory is, and how it works. And then we'll also talk about getting into some security groups and things like that. So let's talk about Active Directory basics. Active Directory, it's a directory service. It houses all the information about everything. We talked about this in previous modules already. It has every type of object, and those objects can be users, can be computers, can be printers, can be groups, and other things. It's also responsible for providing a central listing of resources. And it makes it so you can easily find them. For instance, if you want to find a printer and you list it in Active Directory, you should be easily be able to locate that printer using a search. Active Directory is used to manage accounts, groups, and lots of other things. So we do that by creating a domain controller. Now we created a domain controller, or actually a couple of them in Labs 1 and 2. Servers that have Active Directory domain services role are capable of being domain controllers. A domain controller contains a writable copy of Active Directory. So basically that means you can add objects to Active Directory and it will synchronize from one server to the next. If you don't have Active Directory installed, then you have a simple member server. It's just a server without Active Directory. Now every once in a while I'll run into that when I go to a client where they have a Windows server, maybe it's a 2008, 2012, or even 2016, and they don't have Active Directory installed because the person who installed it didn't understand how it worked, so they just left it alone. You could still use it as a file and print server, but it doesn't come with any of the security that Active Directory offers. So if they need to be compliant, and most every company does nowadays, then having Active Directory installed is really the way to go. You shouldn't leave your computer as just a member server, which is what it is out of the box. Now, a member server can also be a member of Active Directory. So instead of being a member of just a work group like it is by default, you can then make it a member of Active Directory. And when you do that, you have all of the protections now with the Active Directory domain controller. A domain is basically a container. It holds information about all the network resources that are in it. And as I mentioned before, every resource in it is called an object. And no one object is more important than another object. They're just different. So if you have a lot of different domain controllers, then the way, even two domain controllers, then the way that Microsoft refers to this is multi-master replication. So back in NT4 and NT3.5 back in the 90s, you had a primary domain controller and then a secondary domain controller. And when they came out with Windows 2000, they said, you know what, we're not going to do that anymore. Every server is going to be equal. They're all going to have be capable of being a master domain controller. All of them are capable of holding the 5 master roles, which we'll talk about a little bit. And they contain the full range of information, everything that makes up Active Directory. So no one domain controller is more important than any other domain controller. Active Directory can replicate individual properties instead of entire accounts. So in 2016, it's a little bit more efficient than it used to be. So let's say I go in and change the password of a user. Instead of replicating the entire user information about that particular object, it just replicates the password change. So it does it much more quickly. It's a much smaller amount of data to replicate. It also can change the type of protocol used based on the speed between the domain controllers. So if the domain controllers are in the same network, the same LAN, then it's likely that they are on a very quick connection. So it uses a protocol-heavy type of thing, well, it's called the RPC protocol, that replicates between the two domain controllers. However, if it notices it has a very slow connection, then it's going to use the SMTP protocol instead to replicate those changes. It's a much lighter weight protocol. It takes longer to replicate all of the changes, but it can do it over a slower line without slowing things down too badly. So SMTP, as you may recall, is also Simple Mail Transport Protocol, which is the same thing that Microsoft uses to send email. They just found it to be a very efficient way of also replicating Active Directory. So there's three general concepts important to understand: the schema, the global catalog, and the namespace. The Active Directory schema defines the objects and the information pertaining to those objects that can be stored in Active Directory. So the schema is basically like the entire setup. You have to have what's called a schema master, one of the servers that's in charge of the schema itself. It's basically the hierarchy of Active Directory. How it's all put together would be the schema. And you have to have one of the domain controllers to be in charge of that. Now, by default, the first domain controller is going to have all those master roles, and one of them is going to be the schema master. But if you have many different domain controllers, you just have to pick which one you want to be the schema master, or you can just leave it on the default first domain controller. The user account, one class of object in Active Directory, is defined through schema elements unique to that class. So you also have the global catalog, which stores information about every object within the forest. So the schema basically takes care of the structure of Active Directory, but the global catalog has a copy of every single object. So for instance, the global catalog server will have a copy of every username, every password, every bit of information about that user, and about every computer and everything else. Every domain controller by default is going to also be a global catalog. So you would have to manually turn that off to make it go away. Now, you don't want to make the mistake where you turn off global catalog on every single domain controller, then none of the domain controllers will have a copy of the Active Directory objects, and then you're going to have a real problem when nobody can log in. Now, there was a time when storage was expensive, that didn't come very large, where you were worried about having more than one global catalog server. But that time has passed. The global catalog is very small and a relative size to the hard drives nowadays. So it doesn't hurt at all to have every single server be a domain catalog that is a domain controller. Serves a lot of purposes. Central storehouse for all the objects, as I mentioned before. Provides lookup and access to all resources. Provides replication to Active Directory from one server to another. Keeps a copy of all the attributes. Active Directory uses domain name system. Now, prior to Windows 2000, you didn't use DNS for storing or accessing names of computers to IP addresses. It used a WINS server, a Windows server, which is a WINS database. Now it uses domain name system, which is exactly what the internet uses. So if you were going to go to google.com, Google is the name, but the IP address that's tied to it, you don't want to have to memorize. You only want to have to remember Google. You don't want to have to remember the IP address. And that IP address changes depending on where you are in the country, because it'll send you to whichever Google website is closest to you. So Active Directory does a very similar thing. It creates what's called forward lookup zones and reverse lookup zones. So these forward lookup zones basically is the name of the server. So dco1.widgetllc.internal. That's pointed to 192.168.0.1. That would be a host record right there. There's the name, there's the IP address. That's a host record sitting in the DNS server. So all you have to remember is dco1. It fills in the rest of it and already knows what IP address it is. Without DNS, you wouldn't have that. DNS uses what's called a namespace. A namespace basically includes the entire name of the object, the domain, and the last part of it would be the highest level of the domain, which would be .internal in our case. But it could be .com if it was on, say a website. So it's a logical area on a network that contains directory services and named objects, and it has the ability to perform name resolution. So all these things are part of DNS. It also contains what's called the fully qualified domain name, and that's where you have a DC equals widget LLC, DC equals internal. That means domain controller for that particular thing. So DC is part of the fully qualified domain namespace, and all that's part of DNS. It's all stored in DNS, so it's very important. So Active Directory employs two different kinds of namespaces, a contiguous one in which every child object has the name of the parent object. So for instance, DC01 is part of the widget LLC.internal, but you could also have a child domain, such as a domain may be in another state. So we could say San Francisco.widget.llc.internal. That may be a child domain inside the widget.llc.internal domain namespace. That would be what's called a contiguous namespace because it would have the widget.llc.internal as part of its name. Whereas a disjointed namespace, it does not resemble the name of the parent object. So if I created a second domain and say I called it widgettools.internal, so that's a completely different name. That's a disjointed namespace. And you can certainly do that. Active Directory will keep track of it if you want. If you have two companies, it may make sense to make two different domain namespaces. AD has a tree-like structure, as you can see here. There's the forest at the top when you create your first Active Directory domain. What it does is it creates a forest as well as a domain. And inside that domain, you have any child domains and any other separate domains from it. So when we created ours, we created a forest, we created a domain, and by default, the forest and the domain will have the same name. So our forest name is widget.llc.internal, and our domain name is widget.llc.internal, which is kind of interesting. So if you wanted to create another domain, you certainly could, but its forest name will always be widget.llc.internal because that's the first one you created. Now, if you're going to go into a company where you're going to create from scratch multiple domain names, you probably want to rethink creating your first domain name being also the forest name. You may want to have a different forest name altogether. That makes more sense. So here's another picture of what a forest might look like. You see at the top, you've got partsplus.com and you've got other child domains underneath it, or children domain underneath it. So one thing about a child domain is the child domain trusts the parent. So basically, the parent can see everything that the child can see. However, it doesn't work the other way. The parent doesn't trust the child, just like in real life, and so the child can't see everything that the parent domain can see. So in some cases, that may make sense when you have sub companies or companies that are purchased. A forest provides a means to relate trees that use a contiguous namespace in domains within each tree. But they can also have disjointed namespaces in relationship to each other. So the advantage of joining trees into a forest is that all domains share the same schema and global catalog. So it's easier to find resources that way. It's easier to find objects that way. So that's why you want to do that. Now we also have something called a forest functional level. Every version of Windows has a forest and also a domain functional level. So 2016 recognizes forest functional levels all the way back to Windows 2000 native. So basically that means every time Microsoft came out with a new version of Windows, it upgraded its forest and its domain functional level to have additional group policy objects and additional security. When servers are upgraded, you may want to raise the forest functional level. So let's say, for instance, you have a 2012 domain controller and you have a 2016 domain controller in the same domain and forest. So if I were to upgrade my 2012 domain controller to a 2016, all I would have is 2016. I would no longer have 2012. So I would want to upgrade my forest and my domain functional level to match whatever the lowest operating system is. So in this case, I've upgraded to 2016. Everything's 2016. Therefore, I'm going to make my forest and domain functional level 2016. And this is how you do that. You go into Active Directory Domains and Trusts, which is in Server Manager under the Tools menu, and you'll go and click Raise Forest Functional Level. You do the same thing by clicking on the domain level to upgrade the domain level. And then you'll have the latest and greatest thing. So one thing that a lot of people are confused about is, well, what if I still have a 2008 or 2012 server? Will they stop working? The answer is no. The only thing that will stop working is if you have a domain controller that is older than the functional level that you have. So if I have a 2012 domain controller and I upgrade my forest and domain functional level to 2016, that 2012 won't work anymore. So I've just broken it. So you want to make sure that you choose the functional level to whatever the lowest domain controller is. You can still have older servers than that. You can have a 2008 server. That's no problem at all. It just can't be a domain controller. Now we break up all of these things into what's called an organizational unit, and we do that in Active Directory users and computers. So they look sort of like folders, and you'll see this, of course, in your labs. And each one of these organizational units contain either computers or users or groups or a combination of all these things. And this is basically done so you can make group policy work. So for instance, if I want to use group policy to block the control panel so users can't make changes on their computers, then I can do that by saying, okay, I'm just going to block this for, say, the admin staff. So the admin staff cannot see their control panel. So I would go into Group Policy Editor and I would edit it so they could no longer see control panel. However, I would not block that from the IT staff because they have more computer expertise and we don't want to block that from them. So you can create group policies that are tied to these organizational units. Now let's say that we have two domain controllers in Portland and we have two domain controllers in San Francisco. So when people log in, they authenticate to the Active Directory domain. Now by default, if you just have one site, then that basically means that the people in San Francisco, when they go to log in, they may either authenticate to a San Francisco domain controller or they may authenticate to a Portland domain controller. It's a round robin kind of a thing. So some people may log in very quickly because they get the San Francisco one. Some people may log in very slowly because they get the Portland one. We don't want that. That's not efficient. So what we do is we create multiple sites, and we do this in Active Directory sites and services. So we go in, we create a second site, we create a San Francisco site, we create a Portland site, we put in the domain controllers in those sites. And so that way when Portland people log in, they only authenticate to a Portland DC, and when San Francisco people log in, they only authenticate to a San Francisco DC. Makes it run much faster and more efficient. So there are the reasons to define a site, like I just mentioned. One of the disadvantages to creating domain controllers in multiple locations is that you could end up slowing down the network. Well, nowadays that's really not the case. Back when the average connection was a T1 speed, 1.5 megabits, that was a real issue replicating Active Directory. Now the average speed is 50 to 100 megabits. It's no big deal. But if you are in the situation where you have a slow connection to a location that has a domain controller, needs to be replicated, then you can create what's called a bridgehead server. So let's say San Francisco has 5 domain controllers. Instead of the Portland's domain controllers replicating with all 5 of them, we'll create one of those servers as what we'll call a bridgehead server. So Portland will replicate with just the one server in San Francisco, and then that one San Francisco domain controller will replicate with the other 4 that are in the site. That way you only have one replication going between the 2 sites rather than all 5. So we want to keep Active Directory as simple as possible and implement the least number of domains and domain controllers as possible while still staying redundant. Otherwise things get complicated and it makes it difficult to transition from one IT person to another because it's difficult to learn a complex situation. Use organizational units to reflect the organization structure. Basically that means it makes good sense to say, let's create an HR OU, let's create an admin OU, an IT OU, an accounting OU, or you could go by geographical. You could say make a San Francisco OU, a Portland OU, a London OU, etc. And you can assign group policies to those. You can also make organizational units as sub-organizational units to other ones. So you can create group policies. So let's say, for instance, we do go by geographic. So Portland has its own OU and San Francisco has its. Underneath the Portland OU, then you can create the individual departments such as HR, IT, etc. And then assign group policies to those. So now we're into a new era of cloud computing, and not everyone is going to have their domain controllers on site. Some are going to have them in what's called a private cloud, which is maybe a data center where the admin of that company controls it. And in other cases, you're going to be in the public cloud, such as Microsoft Azure. If that happens, you can create a tunnel between your on-premises equipment and Azure's virtual machines. And you can replicate that data back and forth to Microsoft Azure. You could also just remove all of the physical computers or domain controllers and servers at your site and just use cloud ones as well if you want to do it that way. Of course, there's advantages and disadvantages. There's always a potential of being hacked when it's outside of your control, the internet going down, making it so you can't have access to anything. But on the plus side, you no longer have to buy any hardware and maintain any of that. So there's reasons for and against that whole thing. When you first install Active Directory, you're going to get an administrator account and a guest account. The guest account is disabled by default, and the administrator account is enabled, and it is your super user that you use for everything. You can rename it, you can create a duplicate of it, you can disable it as long as you have another one that you've enabled under a different name. So you can do a lot of different things with the administrator account. Now, if you compare that to Windows 10 or 8 or any other client operating system, it's different. Both the administrator and the guest are disabled by default, and if you want the administrator turned on, you have to go in and enable it. However, the first user that logs into a Windows 10 or older operating system is the local administrator to that computer. So you don't have to have an administrator turned on like you will on a server. New accounts are created by installing the local users and groups MMC snap-in, or you can just go into Active Directory users and computers from the tools menu. And then you're going to see Active Directory, which gives you a list of all the OUs as well as all of the objects, which you have seen in the first module. So when a user takes a leave of absence, you have some options. You can disable the account, you can delete the account. Of course, you don't recommend that if they're coming back. You can disable the account by date. You can say when this person is going to go on vacation or is going to be gone for any length of time, more than just a few days. You can go in and disable it and then re-enable it by date as well. You can also move employees from one department to another. So let's say somebody moves from the admin staff to the HR staff. Well, you want different group policies to apply to them. So you can just drag their user account in Active Directory users and computers from one OU to the other, and they'll have the new group policies applied to them at the new OU that they are. A lot of times people will call me up and say, hey, what's my password? And I say, I don't know. Microsoft will not tell me your password. So in Active Directory, it doesn't store your passwords in a readable form. It is completely encrypted. So if somebody says they forgot their password, your only option as an IT administrator is to reset the password for them. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, of course, if you keep a copy of their passwords, that's a different thing. Let's say on an Excel worksheet or something like that. If an account is no longer going to be used, then of course you'll want to delete it, but sometimes you just want to disable it until you make sure that you've audited everything that they've done. Otherwise, you could expose yourself to some security risks. When you delete an account, it uses what's called a GUID, which is a global unique identifier. It's a number that's attached to the user. You never really see that part of it. You just see the username itself. And that GUID number is also deleted and cannot be reused. So let's say you create another account with the same name. That person comes back to the company, you welcome them back, you recreate their account. It's going to have a completely different global user ID. So that's nothing that you have to worry about on a day-to-day basis. It's just something you need to be aware of in case you left that user say, have access to a shared folder. So what's going to happen when you delete the user, then you're going to have to re-add that user even though they have the same name because they have a different GUID. One of the best ways to manage accounts is by grouping accounts that have similar characteristics. As I mentioned before, you could put them into organizational units, but you can also create groups. You can create a group, a security group, and say you can put all the HR folks into the HR security group, and then when you give them access to the HR folder, you only have to add the HR group to that folder. You don't have to add everyone individually. Now there's different types of groups. We can create a local group, which is local to a computer, which is non-Active Directory. We can create a domain local, which is going to be the domain that you're on. We can create a global which covers all the domains in the forest. And we can create a universal group which covers all of the forests and all of the domains. So it depends on the reach of the group that you want them to have, of the type of group that you want to do. Now in a non-Active Directory situation, you can do the local one. But if you have Active Directory, then local is out. So the lowest one you can start with is domain local, which is just the domain that you're in. All these groups can be used for security or distribution groups. So when you go to create a group, you have the option for creating a security group or creating a distribution group. So distribution group is typical for like email and phone lists and things like that. If you don't host your email locally, then this may not be of any use to you. If you do either have Azure hosting your email through Office 365 and you synchronize Active Directory between the two, then that will work. And of course, if you have an Exchange server locally, then it'll absolutely work. But otherwise, most of the time, you're going to be creating security groups which give access to resources such as shared folders. Instead of installing AD, you can divide accounts into local groups. This is not recommended. As I said earlier, it doesn't have the same level of security or encryption, but you can certainly create local security groups if you don't have Active Directory. So we talked about the domain and the global. This is what a universal group would look like. You can see this middle one here is a universal group. And so it covers all the other domains and forests. So if you put resources into there, they have the opportunity to have access to the resources in all the different forests and all of the domains. Definitely want to think very hard before putting people into that. You can configure the properties of a specific group by double-clicking on that group. You go to Active Directory Users and Computers, and you can go ahead and add members to those groups, which is something that you did I believe in Lab 2. And you can also go into the user account itself and make it a part of other groups. So you can either go to the group or go to the user and either add the group or add the user to that group. So it's pretty easy to add users into groups. Profiles. So every time you log onto a computer, you create a profile. The first time you log in, it's automatically created under your user account name under the users folder. And it has settings such as what the desktop looks like, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the disadvantages to the user profiles is that it's local to that computer. So what Microsoft did was they came up with what's called a roaming profile. So a roaming profile allows you to store any user's profile, such as their .my documents, et cetera, onto a network share. When it's done that way, then you can back it up. So if for some reason that computer dies, the user doesn't have to recreate everything all over again. And there is the profile path you can set up for a roaming profile. And that is when you double click on a user in Active Directory Users and Computers. So there's important features, 5 important or new features in 2016. Restart capability, read-only domain controller, cloning domain controllers, et cetera, et cetera. So let's look at the restart capability. Windows Server 2016 provides the option to stop Active Directory domain services without taking down the computer. So if you want to restart Active Directory domain services, you used to have to restart the whole server, and that could be very inconvenient. You can now also create what's called a read-only domain controller. That started in 2012. That means you can create a domain controller that cannot be written to, but can receive all the information from another writable domain controller. So if you have a remote office where you have a place where you don't need to create anything, it just needs to receive information for the local users, then a read-only domain controller is a good way to go. It's also more secure because you can't write to it. 2012 R2 introduced the ability to clone domain controllers. Cloning cuts down on steps required to create additional virtual domain controllers, so it just saves a lot of time. You can create multiple copies virtually of any domain controller. Active Directory is a directory service to house information about network resources, of course. These are basically to summarize. We talked about Active Directory. Active Directory's servers are called domain controllers. And the most basic part of Active Directory is an object. We talked about global catalogs containing a copy of everything in Active Directory. Talked about the namespace. And we talked about the hierarchy of containers, forests, trees, and domains, and of course organizational units for group policies. So that pretty much covers our Module 3. And so now you can go into Lab 3 and you can go ahead and start that. And of course, if you have any problems, you can click on the little mini videos that are inside the lab, or you can give me a call or email me as per the information in the syllabus. So good luck on Module 3, and we'll see you in Module 4.